Moonrise, Chapter 9, Complicated. Here we were again, back in school. Jasper and I sat in Spanish class, as Mr. Ingram sat at his computer, doing who knows what. Jasper sat beside me, pretending to do his work, but really watching me as I doodled in my notepad. Jasper chuckled as I huffed for the third time and turned the page to a blank one. "I would love to know what you're trying to draw that you can't," he said, and elbowed me softly in the stomach. "Nothing. I'm just bored," I said with a smile. This time my hand flew across the page, drawing a necklace that I had seen pop up a lot in my visions as Jasper searched for the perfect anniversary present. "Really, Alice? Are we still on this?" he said with mock anger. "You're such a cheater, Alice," he continued with narrowed eyes. "I'm not cheating," I murmured to him. "But still, I do like it," I said with a laugh, which made him sigh. "Fine, but you have to tell me what you got me." I shook my head. "I'll take it back," he said with a smirk, and I felt him manipulating my emotions so I would give in. "No, you won't. But I will give you a hint that may be true," I said with a smile. He was silent as he waited for me to go on. "It isn't here, not in a small town like Forks, or even in the state for that matter. It may not even be in this country," I said to him. "You better not be taking me on a worldwide shopping trip with you again," he said with a frown. "No, you don't like that. It is our anniversary, which means we do something we both enjoy," I said in a quiet whisper. "Ah," he said as he ran his fingers through his perfect honey blonde hair. Is it—" "No guessing, or I won't be taking you. I will tell you when I'm ready," I said with a smirk. "That is definitely not fair," he said. "Life isn't fair," I said with a giggle. "We don't live," he mouthed with a chuckle. "Whatever, Jasper," I murmured. I opened my notebook back up to the notes for the class as Mr. Ingram started to walk around and see what people have done. Jasper and I had already finished the packets as he came to our table. Mr. Ingram issued the class homework, and a minute later the bell rang. Jasper and I split up as he went to statistics and I went to geometry. I really hated that class. It was so boring. I took my seat in the back of the classroom and ignored the lesson, letting my mind wander. With my mind focused on Jasper, the class ended quickly. I walked to the science building and went to biology. I sat down in Mr. Banner's class, and Angela sat next to me. Lauren and Jessica sat in front of us, and they would turn their heads and glare at me every few minutes. I listened in to see what they were talking about as I heard Edward's name. "Bella definitely didn't tell us everything about what happened in Port Angeles. Maybe she knows something," Jessica said to Lauren. "You're right, and the fact that none of them were in school yesterday or the day before that has to mean something," Lauren said. I sighed as I continued to listen. This could end badly. "Ask her," Lauren said. "No way. I got the stuff from Bella. Now it's your turn," Jessica said. I didn't want to talk to either of them, but they both turned around to look at me. "Hi, Alice," Lauren said. Mr. Banner brought his attention to our tables and cleared his throat. "Lauren, do you have something to share with the class?" No," she stuttered, and they both turned back around. I laughed to myself, somewhat uncomfortable, as I felt the blood rush to their faces, making my throat burn. They continued to whisper and glare at me during the entire class, until the bell rang. I walked to gym class quickly, not turning around to look behind me. Edward and I partnered up for badminton. I hated gym. Our entire family did. There was no reason for us to go through the awful class. Lauren and Jessica were in the class as well. They were on the other side of the net, giving Edward weird looks. Edward ignored them and went on throughout gym class as if nothing was going on. The bell rang, and I headed towards my locker, knowing that Jasper would meet me there. Stress started to fill my body as I continued to walk. No one but Edward and I knew that Bella knew about us, and they were all about to find out. I stopped at my locker and opened it. A strong hand rested on my shoulder, and I felt the warmth and presence of my husband. "There seems to be something bothering you. What's wrong? You were stressed," he murmured, and squeezed my shoulder. I sighed and shook my head. I put my book away and shut my locker. Jasper wrapped his arm around my waist, and we started to walk to the cafeteria. Jasper and I sat in our usual spot, with our tray of food that would remain untouched, along with Emmett and Rosalie. Edward was in line with Bella, who looked nervous about something. Jasper followed my line of vision and saw the two of them as well. They sat at their table, Bella sitting across from him. He shoved the tray of food toward her. "Take whatever you want," he said kindly. She picked up an apple and held it for a while. "I'm curious," she said finally. "What would you do if someone dared you to eat food?" she asked. Jasper, Emmett, and Rosalie all stiffened at hearing those words come from the human girl. "What the hell is she talking about?" Rosalie hissed as she glared at me. I stayed silent and met her gaze calmly. Her eyes narrowed as she realized I wasn't going to answer, and she growled. "I know that you know what's going on," she said to me angrily. Her face was a mere foot away from mine as she leaned forward in her seat. "She knows about us," I finally whispered as I leaned away from her. "Since when?" she growled. "Yesterday," I murmured. "And you knew? Alice, how could you? I could expect Edward to do something like that, but—" "Rosalie, calm down," Emmett said, as he took one of her hands, but she firmly pushed him away. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked me furiously. "Did she tell you?" Rosalie asked as she turned her gaze on Jasper. He stood stock still, and I thought for a moment he was mad at me. But then he relaxed and silently shook his head. "You didn't even tell your husband?" she said as she glared at me. "I couldn't. You have to understand. I couldn't tell him, and he understood and didn't pressure me about it. He knew something was bothering me, but he knew I wasn't ready to tell him," I whispered. "Rosalie," Jasper said firmly, but she continued to glare at me. "It was not my job to tell you. It was his. It is his problem, and he didn't tell you, but trust me, he's going to," I said quietly. "When? When the Volturi come knocking at our door to kill us? That's—" "Enough, Rosalie," Jasper cut in as he placed a hand over my own. A calm atmosphere stood around our table as he tried to calm Rosalie's temper. I turned my head back to watch Edward and Bella, and grimaced as I watched him take a bite of pizza. "If someone dared you to eat dirt, you could, couldn't you?" he asked scornfully. "I did once, on a dare," she confessed. "It wasn't so bad." He laughed. "I suppose I'm not surprised." His eyes went around the cafeteria for a moment, landing on our table as he did so, and then turned back to Bella. "Jessica's analyzing everything I do. She'll break it down for you later." He pushed the rest of the pizza toward her. She put down the apple and took a bite of the pizza, looking away. "So the waitress was pretty, was she?" he asked casually. "You really didn't notice?" "No, I wasn't paying attention. I had a lot on my mind." "Poor girl." "Something you said to Jessica. Well, it bothers me." His voice was husky, and he glanced up from under his lashes with troubled eyes. "I'm not surprised you heard something you didn't like. You know what they say about eavesdroppers," she reminded him. "I warned you I would be listening." "And I warned you that you didn't want to know everything I was thinking." "You did," he agreed, but his voice was still rough. "You aren't precisely right, though. I do want to know what you're thinking. Everything. I just wish that you wouldn't be thinking some things." "That's quite a distinction," she said with a frown. "But that's not really the point at the moment." "Then what is?" she asked. They were looking across the table now, looking at each other intently. "Do you truly believe that you care for me more than I do for you?" he muttered, leaning closer to her as he spoke. "You're doing it again," she muttered. His eyes opened wide with surprise. "What?" "Dazzling me," she admitted. "Oh," he frowned. "It's not your fault," she sighed. "You can't help it." "Are you going to answer the question?" She looked down. "Yes." "Yes, you are going to answer the question, or yes, you really think that?" He was irritated again. "Yes, I really think that." She kept her eyes down on the table. The silence dragged on between the two of them. "You're wrong." His eyes were gentle as he spoke to her this time. "You can't know that," she disagreed in a whisper. She shook her head and looked down at her hands again. "What makes you think so?" he said quietly. "Let me think," she insisted, and he started to scowl at her. His expression cleared, now that he was satisfied that she was planning to answer. "Well, aside from the obvious, sometimes," she hesitated. "I can't be sure. I don't know how to read minds. But sometimes it seems like you're trying to say goodbye when you're saying something else." "Perceptive," he whispered. "That's exactly why you're wrong, though." He began to explain, but then his eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, the obvious?" "Well, look at me," she said. "I'm absolutely ordinary. Well, except for bad things like near-death experiences and being so clumsy that I'm almost disabled. And look at you." She waved her hand toward him. Emmett laughed, but stopped as soon as Rosalie hit him hard across the chest. "This is not funny," she hissed at him. "You don't see yourself very clearly, you know. I'll admit you're dead on about the bad things," Edward chuckled blackly. "But you didn't hear what every human male in this school was thinking on your first day." "I don't believe it," she mumbled to herself. "Trust me just this once. You are the opposite of ordinary." "But I'm not saying goodbye," she pointed out. "Don't you see? That's what proves me right. I care the most because if I can do it—" He shook his head, seeming to struggle with the thought. "If leaving is the right thing to do, then I'll hurt myself to keep from hurting you, to keep you safe." "And you don't think I would do the same?" she asked as she glared at him. "You'd never have to make the choice. Of course, keeping you safe is beginning to feel like a full-time occupation that requires my constant presence." He smiled brilliantly at her, making her look down for a moment. "No one has tried to do away with me today," she reminded him. "Yet," he added. "Yet," she agreed. "Easy, Rose," Emmett whispered from beside her. His arm was around her shoulders, restraining her by pulling her towards him. She sat in her seat beside me, rigid. "Sorry, Edward. She could tell that Bella knew too much from your conversation. And, well, it would have been much worse if I hadn't told her the truth right away. Trust me on that." I thought, knowing Edward would hear me. Edward's eyes were on our table as he looked at our faces. He looked away with narrowed eyes after a second.
I have another question for you.
His face was still casual. Shoot.
Do you really need to go to Seattle this Saturday? Or was that just an excuse to get out of saying no to all your admirers?
You know, I haven't forgiven you for the Tyler thing yet. It's your fault that he's deluded himself into thinking I'm going to prom with him.
Oh, he would have found a chance to ask you without me. I just really wanted to watch your face, he chuckled. If I had asked you, would you have turned me down? He asked, still laughing to himself.
Probably not, she admitted. But I would have canceled later, faked an illness or sprained an ankle. He was puzzled.
Why would you do that?
You've never seen me in gym, I guess, but I would have thought you would understand.
Are you referring to the fact that you can't walk across a flat, stable surface without finding something to trip over? Edward asked with a laugh.
Obviously.
That wouldn't be a problem.
He was very confident.
It's all in the leading.
He could see that she was about to protest, and he cut her off.
But you never told me. Are you resolved on going to Seattle, or do you mind if we do something different?
I'm open to alternatives, she permitted. But I do have a favor to ask. He looked weary, as he always did.
What?
Can I drive? He frowned.
Why?
Well, mostly because when I told Charlie I was going to Seattle, he specifically asked if I was going alone, and at the time I was. If he asked again, I probably wouldn't lie, but I don't think he will ask again, and leaving my truck at home would just bring up the subject unnecessarily, and also because your driving frightens me. He rolled his eyes.
Of all the things about me that could frighten you, you worry about my driving?
He shook his head in disgust, but then his eyes were serious again.
Won't you want to tell your father that you're spending the day with me?
With Charlie, less is always more, Bella said confidently. Where are we going, anyway?
The weather will be nice, so I'll be staying out of the public eye. And you can stay with me if you'd like to.
Edward, I called in my head and played a vision that I had seen a few days ago. He noticed it immediately, and I smiled. Edward, I love her, Edward. But as I said this, I knew he was blocking me out, because he turned back to Bella. And you'll show me what you meant about the sun? She asked, excited by the idea of unraveling another of the unknowns.
Yes,
he smiled, and then paused.
But if you don't want to be alone with me, I'd still rather you didn't go to Seattle by yourself. I shudder to think of the trouble you could find in a city that size.
Phoenix is 3 times bigger than Seattle, just in population. In physical size.
But apparently, he interrupted her, your number wasn't up in Phoenix, so I'd rather you stay near me.
As it happens, I don't mind being alone with you.
Bella smiled up at him kindly. I know, he sighed, brooding. You should tell Charlie, though.
Why in the world would I do that?
To give me some small incentive to bring you back. His voice had determination in it.
I'll take my chances.
Edward exhaled angrily and looked away.
Let's talk about something else, she suggested.
What do you want to talk about? He asked. He was still annoyed.
She glanced around her. As she moved her eyes around the room, her eyes caught on my own. The others were looking at Edward. She looked away from me then and turned back to Edward. Why did you go to that Goat Rocks place last weekend? To hunt? Charlie says it wasn't a good place to hike because of bears.
Emmett let out a laugh
but was silenced once again by a death glare from Rosalie. "Bears?" she gasped, and he smirked. "You know, bears aren't in season," she added. "If you read carefully, the laws only cover hunting with weapons," he informed her. "Bears?" she repeated with difficulty. "Grizzly is Emmett's favorite." His voice was casual as he told her this. She said. "So," she said after a moment, finally meeting his now anxious gaze, "what's your favorite?" He raised an eyebrow, and the corners of his mouth turned down in disapproval. "Mountain lion." "Ah," she said, in a politely disinterested tone. "Of course," he said, "we have to be careful not to impact the environment with injudicious hunting. We try to focus on areas with an overpopulation of predators, ranging as far away as we need. There's always plenty of deer and elk here, and they'll do, but where's the fun in that?" He smiled teasingly. "Where indeed?" she murmured. "Early spring is Emmett's favorite bear season. They're just coming out of hibernation, so they're more irritable." He smiled. "Nothing more fun than an irritated grizzly bear," she nodded. He snickered, shaking his head. "Tell me what you're really thinking, please." "I'm trying to picture it, but I can't," she admitted. "How do you hunt without any weapons?" "Oh, we have weapons. Just not the kind they consider when writing hunting laws. If you've ever seen a bear attack on television, you should be able to visualize Emmett hunting." "Are you like a bear too?" she asked in a low voice. "More like the lion, or so they tell me," he said lightly. "Perhaps our preferences are indicative." "Perhaps," she said. "Is that something I might get to see?" "Absolutely not." He folded his arms across his chest and looked at her angrily. "Too scary for me?" Bella asked. As she said this, the bell rang, and Rosalie quickly stalked out of the cafeteria, with Emmett following behind her. I stood up, and Jasper did as well. He took my hand, and we started to walk out of the cafeteria, leaving Edward and Bella behind. The silence between us dragged on, and I could feel the tension in his grip, though his hand was soft. I finally gave in. "I'm sorry," I whispered to him. "For what? You've done nothing wrong," he said to me. "No, I have. You're mad at me, I can feel it. Jasper, I'm not mad at you, Alice," he said firmly, as he turned and locked eyes with mine, his golden eyes smoldering. "I just don't understand," he said quietly. "What?" I asked. "You trust me, don't you?" he asked in barely a whisper. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I shut it again and thought about what he had just asked me. He had to know that I trusted him, loved him, and enjoyed every minute I had with him. There was a question hidden inside what he had asked, and it took me a while to understand. "Jasper, the only reason I didn't tell you is because I didn't think I was the one who was supposed to tell everyone. I only knew because of my visions. Also, I didn't want us fussing over someone else's relationship. It is not worth us being torn apart because of her and Edward.
"Alice, look at me, Alice," he said, and my eyes moved back up to his. "Nothing will ever split us up. Yes, I'm upset and bothered by the human girl, but it's only because I want to protect you. I'm glad that Edward has found someone like I have. But she is a human, Alice, and that's dangerous for all of us," he said to me. I looked around us and noticed the halls were almost empty. Some people were walking quickly, while others were standing around talking to friends in the hall. "I'm really not looking forward to going home today," I said with a small laugh. He squeezed my hand. "Maybe we could run home instead of riding with Emmett and Rosalie. I know Rosalie is pissed, and Emmett is just stressed out. I would rather not sit through that yet," he said with a smile, as he pulled me a little closer to him. "I think I'm up for that," I murmured to him. Love filled my body to the brim as Jasper walked me to my class. He let go of my hand, and I whispered so low that only Jasper would have a chance of hearing me. "I love you too." I sat down in my lecture class as the bell rang, and Miss Dan started to immediately lecture on poems and sonnets. She gave us a few handouts, and then went to her desk to check her email. I ignored the work, and flipped through my visions to make the class pass faster. Soon enough, the bell rang, and I walked to my last class. World history dragged on for what felt like days, but finally the day was over. I walked quickly out of the door, not caring to go to my locker and put away my books. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and texted Rosalie, telling her we would not be riding home with her and Emmett. An arm wrapped itself around my thin waist and pulled me close to a familiar body. I melted into Jasper as we started to walk toward the woods. We didn't run home. We walked slowly, cherishing the time we had before all hell would break loose at home. We talked about light topics, not going into anything that would cause problems. I was pulled away from Jasper for a split second, and then sighed as I came back to him. "What's wrong?" he asked, as he gripped my hand closer to his. "Rosalie hates me right now," I murmured. "Just ignore her. Rosalie will always be Rosalie. Don't let her temper get to you," he told me as he kissed me on the cheek. I smiled and tugged on his hand. "We should probably get back. They're starting to wonder where we are, and Edward will be back soon," I said quietly. We ran to the house quickly and walked inside, to be welcomed by Esme and surprisingly Carlyle too. Emmett and Rosalie were sitting on the couch. Rosalie gave me a death glare, and Emmett smiled apologetically at both Jasper and I. We all turned towards the door as we heard the familiar tires turn onto our driveway and speed towards the house. Rosalie was up off the couch and going up to the front door. I caught a glimpse of what she was about to do and quickly went up to stop her. "Rosalie, that's not the greatest idea. You—" "Shut up, Alice. What do you know about great ideas?" she yelled at me, shoving me away from her with force, making me stagger backwards in shock. Jasper let out a light growl, and his arms wrapped around me protectively as he looked at Rosalie. "Rosalie," Carlyle rebuked, but she was already at the door. "You jackass! How could you tell her about us and leave us all clueless?" Rosalie yelled at Edward. Emmett ran out of the door, and we all followed behind him. He went up to Rosalie, who was inches from Edward's face, and pulled her away from him. "I was going to tell you," he growled at her. "It doesn't matter anymore. The human tramp knows about us. She can tell others," she hissed at him. His eyes narrowed at her. "She is not a tramp. If anyone here is a tramp, it's you. The only reason you have cause not to like her is because I chose her and didn't choose you after Carlyle changed you. It eats you up that I chose a human and not you," he growled at her. She screeched at him and pushed herself away from Emmett, slapping him across the face. Carlyle intervened then. "Rosalie, that's enough," he stated firmly. "Please, we need to talk about this calmly," he said, as he dragged Rosalie farther away from Edward. She growled, but listened to what her adopted father told her. "Jasper," Carlyle said, and then there was a calm atmosphere surrounding all of us. I welcomed it. tired of the continuous fighting, as did Esme and Carlyle. Carlyle walked into the house while towing Rosalie with him, and they went into the conference room. He sat her down on top of the table, and he sat down right beside her. Esme followed with Edward, and sat on the opposite end of the table. Emmett sat beside Rosalie, as Jasper and I sat across from the other two. Carlyle made no move to speak. He sat in his chair silently as the minutes ticked by. The rest of us stayed silent as well, until Edward finally spoke. "I am sorry that you had to find out this way, but I was going to tell you all. Trust me on that," he said quietly. Rosalie was about to speak, but Edward put his hand up to silence her and turned to me. "And Alice, I am sorry that I caused you problems as well. This is my problem and not yours. I shouldn't be dragging you into this," he said earnestly. "It's not without cause," I whispered, as I gave him a half-smile. Edward gave me a brief smile and turned to Rosalie. "I can assure you that she won't tell anyone. She knows that the secret is important," he told her quietly. Rosalie looked at him with expressionless eyes, but said nothing. Carlyle took over then. "So she knows about us," he stated quietly. Edward nodded. "One of the young Quileutes talked to her about it. I'm not sure if he knew what he was talking about or not, because he said it was an old, scary story," Edward said. "She used what he told her and researched it more," he continued. Their faces were shocked as he looked around them. Carlyle sighed and ran his fingers through his hair. "Well, we can't take back what's already been done," he trailed off, not knowing what to say. "Everything will be fine. I've seen that," I said confidently. I turned to Edward. "You should probably tell them where you'll be taking her on Saturday," I thought. He nodded. "I will be with her on Saturday," he said. "Where?" Carlyle asked. "The mountains. She wanted to see what I looked like in the sun," he stated quietly. Rosalie let out a huff, while Esme smiled proudly. "You should probably hunt well the day before you go," Carlyle told Edward. He nodded and turned to me. "Alice?" he asked. I saw what he was asking of me, and smiled kindly in response. "Of course I will come with you, but you have to introduce me to Bella first," I thought with a smirk. "Never mind," he said with a frown. "Why not? That is so not fair. She will know me eventually," I continued. "Fine," he huffed, and ruffled my hair with a laugh. I stuck out my tongue, but then laughed as well. "One of us should come with you," Carlyle said quietly. Sometimes Edward and I were a step ahead of everyone else, because of our talents. That's why they are all usually annoyed when we have our little conversations around them. "Alice will come," he said with a slight grimace. Edward turned to look at Jasper for barely a second, and then turned away. "Jasper is okay with it?" I asked in my head. Edward made a face, and I sighed. "Jasper won't mind too much. We won't be gone for too long," I thought. "That's not why," Edward calmly stated, and then looked away from me. I turned my gaze towards Jasper questioningly. His eyes were emotionless, and his smile towards me was grim. Our eyes moved as Rosalie got out of her chair and left the room. "Rose," Emmett whined, and they both walked into the garage while slamming the door behind them. Carlyle turned back to Edward. "You two can leave after lunch on Friday, if you would like. You can get better range and hunt longer," he said with a smile.
Edward nodded, and this time I stood, tugging on Jasper's hand. He looked up at me and stood as well. His arm wound around me, and instead of going up to our room, he walked us outside. We walked for a while, and then Jasper sat down at the edge of the river and pulled me into his lap. I leaned my head back into the crook of his neck and relaxed.
"How does this not bother you?" he asked me quietly.
I have seen so many different, horrible ways that this has turned out because of my visions. Now I don't see anyone getting hurt or leaving anymore, and I'm content with knowing that everyone will be all right, I said quietly.
"You keep dragging yourself deeper and deeper into this," he said as he kissed my neck.
"Jazz, I volunteered myself to go with him because he needs someone supportive to be there with him, and that means minus you, Rosalie, and Emmett. It will help him out," I said. He chuckled softly and turned me around so I was facing him.
"As long as you're safe, I'm fine with whatever you do," he murmured as he pulled me to him.
"Once again, our conversations have turned to you talking about my safety. You are absurd, Jasper," I whispered, and I placed my lips on the base of his neck.
"It's not absurd, my love," he murmured as he pulled my lips to his.
I wrapped my legs around his waist and pulled our bodies close, treasuring the warmth that his body gave me. He pulled away from me and traced my cheekbone. I leaned my head into his chest and let out a soft purr. His fingers moved slowly through my hair, brushing a few strands behind my ear, and then ran down my arm tenderly. I leaned my lips up to his ear and let out a small giggle before speaking. "Yes, it is.